Well, hello and welcome back to The Commonplace. My name is Autumn. I like to talk about books. And today we're going to continue with our Mother Culture series with 7 books I think you should read during the bleak midwinter time. It is winter time now. We are headed into the middle of it. I live in the Northeast, so it can get a little doldrumy during the winter. It can be a little bit difficult to push through, and I find that usually it's the best time of year to dig into really big, good novels. And so I have this stack here with my winter cap to signify that we were talking about winter reads. And before we dig into everything that's in this stack, I do want to give a quick refresher on what mother culture is, because mother culture is one of those things that when you Google it, you will find that it has expanded and taken many shapes and forms that it was not in its original mention. And I say mention because Charlotte Mason, if you were here as a Mason educator, did not talk about this, and that kind of surprises people sometimes, right? Because it's such a Mason thing, and yet she did not talk about it. It clearly fits within her pedagogy and philosophy. I'm not saying it doesn't work, I'm just saying it wasn't her thing. So there was a Parents Review article, and the author is just known as A. We don't even have a name for her, but she talked about mother culture as the continued discipline or habit, if we think about our instruments of education, our continued discipline of taking in living ideas, because moms are born persons, we're still persons, and we still need to grow, and the primary way that you grow your mind, your imagination, your judgment, your reason is through story. And she said to do it in about half an hour a day, which I love because, one, moms don't usually have a lot of downtime, and also it keeps us from tipping into book gluttony, which one of the ways that we are book gluttons, those of us who like to read, those of us who like the intellectual life, is that we read when it is a wrong time to do so. It's an improper time to be reading, and yet there we are with our nose stuck in a book. And so half an hour gives you a nice fence from either ditch. And so just wanted to give that recap because mother culture, again, is just one of those things that people, they've really expanded like into sourdough and gardening and cleaning your house, and those things are wonderful and life-giving, and I would call those more of like good patterns of living, or sometimes it tips into classical idea of leisure, but it's not mother culture in its original intent, but books are. And so I have 7 books here. Shocking to you, they are not the Chronicles of Narnia, although I would totally tell you that you should just spend the winter reading Narnia, but that's not what I'm going to do to you today. So let's get started. I have some very lighthearted and delightful readings. I have some easier readings, I have some more difficult, longer readings, and I also have a dystopian novel because, like I said, we're calling it the Bleak Midwinter. I don't have them in order, and I don't have my glasses on because I can't stand the reflection of my glasses. But let's start with, should we start with the Russians? No, we'll start with something lighter. We are going to start with The Awakening of Miss Prim. Okay, so the first book is The Awakening of Miss Prim. Now, I read this in the springtime. I think I would have preferred to read it in the winter so that I could have been motivated into meaningful action in the springtime. This is a lovely book, though, for catching the vision of what a life-giving community looks like. The women in this book are delightful. They're intelligent, they're witty, they're accomplished, and the way they live their lives within their community with their priorities set in different places will be a huge encouragement to any mother teacher who spends much of her time kind of in her home and really trying to be productive and fruitful in a really good Christian sense in her home, and then let it spill out. This will be an encouragement. Like, you have, the woman who owns the bakery shop is only open from 9 to 11 because those are the hours she can allot to it. But even more than that, you do have a couple characters in here that highlight the beauty of a classical education. One of my favorite things about this book is that when they put in an advertisement for a teacher, they specifically do not want someone who has been educated in education. They don't want any of those new educational methods or ideas or progressive takes on children or what a children should be like. Instead, the parents want to be in charge of their children's education. It's not the main part of the book, it's just a part I really liked as an educator. But that way they can continue to bring what is truth, goodness, beauty into their lives in every area. And what's interesting about this character, Prudencia Prim, whom you will love, I loved, is that she does have the right kind of knowledge, but she does not yet have the right kind of loves. And so this book is an easy read. You could probably do it in a weekend. I could not put it down. I spent hours voxing one of my friends about this book. So I highly recommend this one for the winter time when you need a light read. And also I was gonna say, this is the book that this past summer encouraged me to start telling people, please stop by my house unannounced. And then also to practice being prepared for really good hospitality if they did, having a handful of recipes I could make on the fly, having a couple of good cocktails ready to go, having frozen cookie dough balls in the freezer so I could make cookies at the drop of the hat for a certain number of people. This book really inspired what I was doing this past summer. So That's a great one. Okay, the next is Joy in the Morning by P.G. Wodehouse. If you do not know Wodehouse, he is hilarious. I really hope my children grow up in banter like Wodehouse characters. It would just be the most delightful thing around the table. I cannot wait to start reading it to them, but everything that happens in this book makes you go, oh no, and also leaves you chuckling. So if you are looking for something to give you a good taste of British humor, I recommend Joy in the Morning as a good way to start. But after all that happiness, you need some sadness, so we're gonna go to dystopian novels with Brave New World by Huxley. Now, I've talked about this in Patreon just recently. I don't know why it's coming up now again. I mean, I guess it's working itself out in my mind, that I think when we consider the future and maybe some of the maladaptive waves we are being formed and the directions we are heading, I think we are going to be more of a Brave New World than 1984. 1984 is kind of the one that everyone wanted to throw around during 2020, that there's going to be like totalitarian takeovers, and this is from either side. I'm not getting in the weeds here, but I actually think it'll be a lot more like Brave New World, that we have cultivated a love of convenience, which yes, I am talking about in my Dumb Phone series, but also that we love to chase pleasure. We want to make our lives as free of suffering, and we are willing to sacrifice a lot of what makes us humans, what makes us image bearers, in order to have that. And so I think we will be lulled into a stupor, whether that is by endless entertainment on our screens and devices, or by all of the things that make our modern life so easy that we feel entitled to never have to suffer. And I think it'll be a lot more like this. So if you like a good dystopian, I don't recommend them when you're feeling angsty, but I do think they can be really helpful in clarifying and making more clear your vision for your home and for the way you're educating your children and for the things that God has called true and good, beautiful, and the things that have lasted. Getting all of that in order is sometimes helpful when you come at it from a dystopian novel. Okay, speaking of education, why not go to Mansfield Park by Jane Austen? I love Jane Austen. She deserves all of the accolades she has. She is witty and she is delightful, but I never hear anyone talk about Mansfield Park except for, and I will link to my interview with Bethany Douglas, she happened to be reading it. You can tell in the interview that I was also reading it because I'm like, oh no, you too? Me too, it's amazing. But this is probably my favorite Austen novel, actually. I am an Elizabeth Bennet to my heart and core 1,000 times over, but this is a brilliant book. I will try to remember to link below. The Literary Life podcast does an entire, it's not a season, but like an overview of this book chapter by chapter, and it was phenomenal. I highly recommend listening as you read if you want to learn how to be a better reader. But at the end of this book, I will just say that a character feels the weight and shame of not educating well his children, and you will see everything that happens in the story and how what we give as the picture of a flourishing life, what shapes our loves and affections, is what drives us in the world. It's not what we just know rationally, but it is what we love. That's how we primarily orient in God's world, and she does a phenomenal job showing that in this book. Okay, so let's move in to, while we're in some classical ideas, let's go to Tolstoy. This is Anna Karenina. If you've not read it, I recommend this translation, which is the Everyman Classics. You actually see, that was also my Brave New World. They kind of all look like this, but they're some of my favorite translations. The books themselves are beautiful. They're so well bound. I have a Pilgrim's Progress from like the 1800s, I think, that's still beautiful. And so that's how I tipped into Everyman's Classics. And whenever I ask for a book, if they have it, I want theirs. But anyways, this translation is great, and that's important. I have another copy of Anna Karenina. The translation is garbage, so I never really made my way through it. I'm also starting to think that maybe some of my Dostoevskys are bad translations because this has been such a delight to read. So Everyman's Classic, if you want to get into Russian lit, I'm going to recommend. Anna Karenina, I'm only this far in, about 300 pages in, but it is a phenomenal book. There is so much at play in it. If you don't know the general storyline, there is adultery, there are going to be consequences. I can tell it's going to be a sad book, but I do think it's moving well through what I would say might be Lewis's idea of the weight of glory in some respects, but also in the brokenness that ensnares us and how difficult it is to climb out of that and different things like that. I'm sure I would have more to say about this book as I finish it once I see the full picture of what Tolstoy is showing, but I can already tell you I think this would be a great thing to read in the middle of winter. So there you go. My next one is John Steinbeck's East of Eden. Fun side note about Steinbeck. When my daughter was about 2, we don't know how she learned Steinbeck's name, but she would go to the bookshelf and when people were talking about books and say she liked Steinbeck, and it was just really funny. That's the story. Anyways, East of Eden is one of my favorite books. I've actually noticed as I've been working on these lists that I say I have 5 favorite books all the time, and usually I'm talking about 6 books, but this is one of them. And I used to read it every year. I've been out of the habit maybe the last 2 or 3 years, but I'd like to maybe find time to read it again this year. So this, I think John Steinbeck actually called this his first novel, and you can see that it's simple, but it's like deeply, it's almost like a myth, and myth does not mean false. I feel like this is a thing that keeps coming up in conversations that I'm having with people. Myth is just a story about a time before men, the age before men. And so this book actually follows through Genesis, the story of Genesis, essentially, by tracing a heartbreaking story of 2 families in California. And it goes also through Cain and Abel. Like, it continues to extend east of Eden, right? That's where the angels were placed when Adam and Eve had to leave the garden. And so, on the east side. And so it follows that. It's a heartbreaking story, but some of my favorite lines ever written are in this book, and I think it would be a tremendous book to read if you've not during the winter time. And it will leave you with many thoughts as a homemaker and as a mother about the disastrous and painful consequences of not being loved. That's a key part of this book. Not the whole thing, but it's definitely a big part that I think as I read it, as I have been reading it once I've become a mother, you kind of read things a little bit differently, right? That's something that I think could be really encouraging for a mom. And then lastly, this is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. If you know Susanna Clarke, this was her debut novel, which my husband and I cannot get over. He also just finished this. We are currently mad obsessed with Fairy, F-A-E-R-I-E, The Place, which I'm also reading Tolkien's Leaf and Tree right now. If you want to dive more into the idea of fairy and fairy tales, it's really wonderful. But this book is fantastic. The only way I can describe it is something like Jane Austen met Grimm's fairy tale. It's a little bit dark, but it's so witty, and the characters are so well crafted and explained and introduced that it almost feels like a Dickens novel. I think Dickens has amazing characters, and you will be absorbed. There are a couple parts where Jonathan Strange is at war and you're like, this is kind of digging on, but basically during the time of Napoleon, English magic is on the brink of coming back, and not just theoretical magicians, but practical magicians. And there's a prophecy that there will be 2, and the 2 come into play, of course, and they're trying to help Britain not only defeat Napoleon in the war, but also these 2 want to make English magic respectable again. And it's dark and it's twisted and it's really quite lovely. And I've talked about Piranesi before, which was her second book that she released in 2020. This is an entirely different ballgame. I still recommend Piranesi, but for a Bleak Midwinter read, I'm gonna say you need to get lost in this tale of fairy. And I've not met anyone that I have recommended this to who did not love it. And I cannot say that about every book I recommend, but definitely this one. So I hope that gives you a list, they'll all be linked below, to maybe pull from this winter as you're looking for something, maybe another world to get lost in, or something to encourage you in the work you're doing in your home. You will never beat getting lost in a story. Whether you have the idea of being story formed or being restoried, we are people of a story, and we are most transformed and changed by story. I'm gonna let you know, of course, I have my Patreon. I would love for you to join us in there. We talk about the literary life a lot. In fact, we just had a wonderful discussion of people realizing that they've been reading practical theology reads for years, and yet what they found is once they became classical educators and they actually started reading the classics, the really good stories that have continued to shape men throughout time, that is when they saw themselves beginning to change. Their loves began to change, and it's because we know that God loves to work through story. So my name's Autumn. I'll be back next week with another video, and I'm so glad you're here. See you then.